In this video, we're going to talk about default constructors. We've already talked a little bit about constructors. We know that a constructor in general is a member function that has the same name as the class. And typically, what you do in a constructor is you initialize the members of the object. Like if you have an integer, you set it to 0. If you have a pointer, you might set it to null, or you might allocate memory for it. They have no return type because they implicitly return an object of the class. So here in our rectangle object that we looked at a bit last week, we have a constructor, and it's called rectangle, and it takes two arguments, W and L. And when we make a rectangle object, right, we declare it down here, we have the class name, and then we have the name of the variable. After the name of the variable, we pass in 5 and 10 in parentheses, and this tells the compiler we want to use our constructor that takes two integers as arguments to initialize our rectangle object, and it's going to set the length field to L and the width field to W. Okay, so this constructor helps us initialize this object. But there's kind of an annoying thing here, and it's that we have to know when we declare rectangle how we want to initialize it. That's not always convenient. It would be nice if I could just declare rectangle, the rectangle variable R, and not specify anything after it. Just say, give me a rectangle, right? But can we do this? Will this code work? And the answer is it won't. It's going to be a syntax error. The compiler requires that we provide two arguments after the name R, because we've said that to make a rectangle, you need two integers, a width and a length. And without those two integers, you can't declare a object of type rectangle. However, if you recall, C++ allows us to have function overloading. And we can actually have multiple functions with the same name, and that extends to constructors. I can have multiple constructors, all with the same name rectangle, but that take different arguments. And what I need to do is make a constructor that takes no arguments. And in that constructor, I can initialize length and width to something meaningful. I could initialize them both to 0. And so that would be like a rectangle that's a single point in space, maybe. But what I do here is I initialize length and width to 1. And so when I make a rectangle object and specify nothing after the variable name, then what the compiler knows is that I want to use the default constructor, the constructor that takes no arguments. And since I provided one, the compiler finds it and it uses that, and now this code works just fine. There is another slightly more sophisticated way I could make a default constructor, and that's with, I could slightly modify my previous constructor but give its parameters default values. So my original constructor that took two integers, I can go in and modify it. And if you guys remember from one of the lectures, one of the videos in the first week, any C++ function, we can modify it and specify a default value for its parameters. There are some constraints on how you do that, but basically what I can do is say, if I don't specify a parameter, then use the value 1. And so if I don't pass in a value for W, the compiler is going to use the value 1. If I don't pass in a value for L, it's going to use the value 1. Okay, so now when I declare my variable R here, and I don't specify any integer values after it, then the compiler knows I'm asking, it knows it wants me to construct a rectangle, and it looks to see, does it have a constructor that matches? And it realizes it does, because you can call this constructor with no arguments, and it knows to substitute a 1 for both the arguments because of the default values. So this also counts as a default constructor that you can call with no arguments because of the default values being passed in. Okay, so a default constructor is a constructor that takes no arguments, or all of its arguments have default values. And so anytime you're looking at an object and you see a constructor like that, you know that what it means is you're allowed to make that object without specifying any information at all. And it will simply get constructed in the default way. And unless you specify otherwise, when you make an object, the default constructor is what will get used. Now, the term we use for constructors that do take arguments and that are not default, right? Those are parameterized constructors. And any constructor that takes an argument is a parameterized one. And a parameterized constructor can be a default constructor if all of its arguments have default values. Okay, so in summary, default constructors either take no arguments or all of their parameters have a default value. An object may have only one default constructor. Okay, only one. And this really comes down to the basic function overloading rule, that the only way the compiler can distinguish functions is based on their arguments. So it doesn't make sense to have two constructors that you could call with no arguments. That's just kind of a fundamental function overloading rule. But it's important for us to think about, right? Because that means there can only be one way to construct an object by default. Also, a class need not have a default constructor at all, right? That rectangle object we started with, it didn't have a default constructor, and it worked fine. We had to specify the two integers every time we made a rectangle when we used that one, but it was allowed. Now, best practice is for all objects to have a default constructor. And that's just so because it makes it easier for a programmer to know how to get started with the object. When you have to figure out how to construct an object before you can even declare it, it's just an added barrier to a programmer trying to use an object you might have implemented. So our custom will be that anytime we make an object, unless we have a good reason not to, we'll also make a default constructor to go with it.